We have a Fox 10 News alert to share with you this morning. Former Vice President Dick Cheney has died. He served in the White House alongside President George W. Bush and played a major role in leading the U.S. into the Iraq War. Cheney was 84 years old. We are told his family was with him when he passed.
On November 3rd, 2025, Dick Cheney, the 46th Vice President of the United States, former Secretary of Defense, and one of the most influential and controversial political figures of the modern era, passed away at the age of 84. Cheney died of complications related to heart disease at his home in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, surrounded by family. His death marks the end of a 5-decade career that left a profound mark on American politics, national security, and global affairs, a legacy that continues to stir admiration and outrage in equal measure. Cheney first rose to prominence in Washington during the 1970s, serving in the Nixon and Ford administrations before becoming Chief of Staff to President Gerald Ford at just age 34. Later, as Wyoming's lone congressman, he established himself as a dependable conservative voice with a reputation for intellect and discipline. But his most notable ascent came in 1989 when President George H.W. Bush appointed him Secretary of Defense. In that role, Cheney oversaw Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm, guiding U.S. military forces during the swift and decisive Gulf War victory that helped define America's post-Cold War military power. After a brief retirement from government service, Cheney returned to the national stage in 2000 as George W. Bush's running mate. His tenure as vice president from 2001 to 2009 proved transformative and deeply divisive. Following the September 11th attacks, Cheney became the most powerful vice president in American history, driving the Bush administration's war on terror. He played a central role in the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, the establishment of the Guantanamo Bay detention facility, and the development of controversial interrogation and surveillance policies that critics said pushed the limits of executive power. To his supporters, Cheney was a model of steely resolve, a man willing to make difficult choices to keep the nation safe. To his detractors, he embodied the excesses of unchecked authority and secrecy that defined America's post-9/11 era. Even after leaving office, Cheney remained unapologetic about his decisions. In interviews and his 2011 memoir, In My Time, he defended the Iraq invasion, the use of enhanced interrogation techniques, and the Bush administration's expansive approach to presidential power. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat," he once said of the Iraq War, a statement that captured both his conviction and the controversy surrounding him. His critics argued that those same policies destabilized the Middle East and eroded America's moral authority, while supporters insisted that his decisiveness prevented future attacks and preserved national security during an age of fear and uncertainty. Outside of politics, Cheney's personal story was equally remarkable. He suffered 5 heart attacks over 4 decades, underwent multiple bypass surgeries, and in 2012 received a heart transplant that extended his life by more than a decade. Through it all, he remained a dominant figure within the Republican Party, both admired for his intellect and feared for his influence. In later years, as his daughter Liz Cheney emerged as a political force in her own right, the Cheney name once again became synonymous with fierce conservatism and an unwavering view of American power. Dick Cheney's death marks the passing of a towering figure in U.S. political history, one whose decisions shaped the trajectory of American foreign policy and whose legacy will be debated for generations. To some, he was a patriot who did what was necessary to defend his country in perilous times. To others, a symbol of the dangers of secrecy, war, and executive overreach. Whatever one's view, there's no denying that Cheney's imprint on the American presidency, national defense, and the modern conservative movement remains indelible. Dick Cheney was 84 years old. I'm Derek Kaufman.
I'm Jason Beckerman.
And this is a special episode of Last Days, Dick Cheney.
Dick Cheney's vice presidency redefined the limits of executive power in modern American history. Following the September 11th attacks, he became the driving force behind policies that vastly expanded the reach of intelligence agencies and the military. The establishment of the Department of Homeland Security, the Patriot Act, and the Bush administration's legal justifications for surveillance and, quote, enhanced interrogation techniques all bore Cheney's imprint. Supporters credit him with ensuring there was never another major terrorist attack on U.S. soil. Critics argue he ushered in an era of secrecy, moral compromise, and diminished civil liberties. His influence on America's national security apparatus continues to shape debates over privacy, wartime ethics, and the balance between liberty and safety.
Cheney transformed the office of the vice president from a ceremonial role into a central force in policymaking. A seasoned Washington insider, he used his deep institutional knowledge to quietly steer key decisions within the Bush administration, particularly on foreign policy and defense. His relationship with President George W. Bush was unique. Bush provided the vision, but Cheney managed the machinery. He controlled access to intelligence, influenced cabinet appointments, and often dictated the tone of internal debate. In doing so, Cheney became arguably the most powerful vice president in U.S. history, a figure who operated behind the scenes with precision and purpose, reshaping the modern executive branch in his image.
So the Bush-Cheney administration is defined by the events of 9/11, right? They happen about 8 months after George W. Bush is sworn in, Cheney is sworn in.
And Bush always seemed in over his head, chasing his father's legacy, not sort of ready to assume the mantle of the presidency as the most powerful person on earth.
And honestly, he was quite unpopular in the first 8 months of his presidency because he did seem a little bit overwhelmed, and he was coming off a quite popular presidency in Bill Clinton's. And so he comes along, and then 9/11 happens. And, you know, I think even Bush's most ardent supporters would acknowledge that in the initial moments after 9/11, My Little Pony
My
event,
Pet Goat.
My Pet Goat event and everything else, he seemed a little in over his head, to your point.
Yeah, deer in headlights. That moment where he's being whispered about the attacks occurring, you needed someone who was very competent and very seasoned in that position, and he looked like a deer in headlights. That's where Dick Cheney rose into ascendance.
Dick Cheney comes, right? And so you've got a couple of years later, as you're preparing for war and you're making the case to the United Nations why Iraq was at the center of the 9/11 attacks and how they're a terrorist state. You know, there's a lot of false information, quite frankly, given to the United Nations. Colin Powell went out there.
Weapons of mass destruction. That's where all these terms came from.
Right. And so behind that, and we saw this and later came out historically, and the movies were done and documentaries were done, Dick Cheney was the man behind the machinery.
Yeah, and he really was a powerful Washington insider. He was very, very hawkish and very firm in his convictions about the power of the executive branch. And he brought that muscular force into the machinery of the government with this sort of seemed like he was from a dynasty, but a kind of a political lightweight. He was a guy who, you know, George W. Bush was a guy who was commissioner of Major League Baseball. He had been governor of Texas, but really needed the support of someone who was a Washington insider, and that's what Cheney brought.
And let's go back to his opinions about the power of the presidency, right, and the power of the executive branch generally. I don't know if he really believed that from the point of view of fiscal policy or social policy, but when it came to wartime policy, he believed any means necessary was what you had to do as a leader. And, you know, there's a real debate, and I think it still exists to this day, like the Patriot Act, for example, really did rein in individual freedom in the most dramatic way, I think, probably since World War II. Yeah. And he was able to justify this crippling of individual freedom based on it's necessary for the war effort. And how do you say no to that when somebody presents it in that way? Like, people are going to die unless we can know what, you know, without warrants, look into everybody's background, know who everybody is.
The surveillance state.
Infiltrate organizations within the United States that seem to be peace-loving, but we think they're Muslims, so they might be a problem, so we're going to infiltrate them. You know,
that's right. And technology of the time, they were the first presidency of the 21st century, really met the moment. You had these robust emergency powers in the post 9/11 landscape that he seized upon and rammed through this sort of legislation about the Patriot Act, which operated for a time, and people were saying, this is okay. I'm willing to go through these sort of sacrifices of my liberty because I'm scared. The nation was very scared in the aftermath, but a lot of these things have stayed in our lives, even after the sort of hysteria of the war on terror and the Iraq invasion being based on false pretenses and so forth. And that's his legacy. His legacy is that he changed that whole apparatus in the shadow of 9/11, and a lot of it is still with us and has created the current moment of fear and desperation.
He became to me, a caricature of someone who's sort of a warmonger and whatnot. He obviously was very instrumental in the efforts to use sort of really heightened levels of interrogation in order to extract things from an enemy. He also shoots his best friend in the face with buckshot and was totally or with birdshot and was totally unapologetic about it.
It's still a story that chased him around.
So he's out on a hunting trip with his friend?
He was out duck hunting. And his friend sort of got a face full of birdshot from Dick Cheney, the vice president of the United States. It was a big sort of laugh moment because the friend did survive and never blamed
he was messed up, though.
He was messed up. Yeah. Picking birdshot out of your face is not an easy task. and these were two older gentlemen already at the time. But, you know, it was a punchline on late night shows. This was at the height of...
But then stories started coming out that they might not have liked each other. They may have been arguing. There was all this like inference that maybe he had actually shot him on purpose. But the man never got out there and said, I'm so sorry what I did to my best friend. You know, it was such an awful event. I'm traumatized. I know he is too. He just sort of
let
said,
the innuendo.
These things happen.
These things happen. And that was Dick Cheney. You know, I want to talk a little bit to pivot to what he meant during the ascendancy of Trump. Because his family, you know, Liz Cheney is a huge political figure, and she stands for something
Republican.
different.
Hates Trump.
Yes.
They hate each other. Trump has forced her out of office. He sort of got the voters behind her to kick her out of office. She was one of the very few Republicans who stood up very strongly to Trump. And
Dick stands for the old guard of traditional conservative values.
Dick Cheney comes up, and he is like, he also dislikes Trump. I mean, it sort of repositioned him a little bit. Like my parents, who are hardcore liberals and hate Donald Trump immensely, but also were very anti-George W. Bush, are like, oh, Dick Cheney's not such a bad guy after all.
That's right. Him dying in this moment contextualizes him differently. When the Bush presidency, George W. Bush's presidency, was in effect, he was a villain. I mean, he seemed like Emperor Palpatine behind the scenes, running the administration, and now people look at him differently. And I do think what is the through line of Dick Cheney is that maybe some people see a malevolence, but there was a lot of conviction in his beliefs about...
Both things can be true, though. You can be convicted and malevolent.
That's right. I guess he can. He was oriented maybe in the wrong direction, but he was not someone who was a flip-flopper and inconsistent over the course of his life.
He wasn't doing it for self-gain. He was doing it because he truly believed that the way forward for an America at war was through a strong executive branch.
That's right.
Stand behind that.
And so many politicians seem to take the sort of temperature of America and follow those tides. And that was not Dick Cheney, and it wasn't Liz Cheney as well. So he instilled these values in his children. I just think he's a fascinating figure because in an era of like chaos that we're living in now, he was a mark of consistency. Even if you weren't on his side of the line, he was a through line of conservative values of the modern era. And Dick Cheney's life spanned quieter beginnings and tumultuous heights, from Wyoming rancher to one of America's most powerful vice presidents in American history. He was masterful in navigating the corridors of power, confident in his convictions, and willing to make unpopular decisions in the name of national security, a posture that earned him both respect and fierce criticism. In the end, his legacy is complicated but undeniable, a man who reshaped the office of the vice president, redefined the limits of American might, and left an indelible mark on the modern era of governance. And so I wanted to give the final word on Dick Cheney's life to the man who chose him as his running mate and led the United States with him for the first 8 years of the 21st century, former President George W. Bush, who said upon learning of the passing of his longtime friend and partner, quote, "Laura and I will remember Dick Cheney for the decent, honorable man that he was. History will remember him as among the finest public servants of his generation, a patriot who brought integrity, high intelligence, and seriousness of purpose to every position he held."